Good day. It's a feature of the Ukraine war that whereas one side, Russia, seems to have an almost morally driven indifference to the public relations side of war, the other side, Ukraine and its Western backers, seem at times almost to structure their entire war effort around public relations. And in my opinion, we've had a spectacular example of this this morning with a explosion which has taken place on the Kerch Bridge. This is the bridge which links the Kerch region of Russia with Crimea. It was a bridge that was built at a time when there was no plan, or so it seems, for a land bridge between Russia and Crimea, and with Ukraine blocking off access by road and rail to Crimea from the north across Kherson region and Zaporozhye region. The Russians, to the intense anger and frustration of the Ukrainians, in record time built the Kerch Bridge. And the Kerch Bridge has remained an issue, a big cause of anger for Ukraine ever since. Now, what I've noticed about these sort of sabotage attacks, and I'm going to come to the details of the sabotage attack on the Kerch Bridge itself, what I've noticed about these sabotage attacks which Ukraine launches is that they tend to correspond with periods of time when things on the battlefronts are either static, as they are at the moment, or not going particularly well for Ukraine. Now, that may be coincidence, and I should say that immediately, because I suspect an incident like the attack on the Kerch Bridge has probably taken quite a long time to plan. So planning for it probably began, well, about a month ago, perhaps even longer, and it would have probably coincided with the start of the Ukrainian offensive at the end of August. So it's probably a part of that. But having said that, it has come at a convenient moment for Ukraine, because as we'll discuss in a moment, the events on the battlefields have been, from Ukraine's point of view, perhaps not so successful over the last few days, a matter which for Ukraine and its offensive must be becoming an increasingly serious issue of concern, because, as is generally acknowledged by close observers of the war, Ukraine's time window for its offensive is now starting to close. Anyway, let's deal firstly with this incident on the Kerch Bridge. Now, it was not an artillery attack or a missile strike. Ukraine doesn't have missiles with a range to attack the Kerch Bridge. It's been constantly, incessantly badgering the United States to supply ATACMS long-range missiles, but the United States up to this time, the Biden administration up to this time, has refused to do so. And I suspect that there's been private warnings from the Russians to the US that if such missiles were indeed ever supplied to Ukraine, there would probably be retaliation by Russia, I'm going to guess, against American facilities possibly around the world. Anyway, the US up to this point in time has refused to supply these ATACMS missiles. This particular act of sabotage was carried out by an explosive device which was in a truck that was passing the Kerch Bridge. And that, by the way, begs some rather interesting questions, because was there anybody in the truck at the time? We're told by the Russians that there'd been no fatalities, so how did a truck get on the bridge without a driver? Did the driver escape? Or, if there was a driver and this person was injured or presumably killed, Did he perhaps not know that there was an explosive device planted inside the truck? Anyway, it was a large device. It did damage to the road surface. It hasn't done any damage to the structure, the structural integrity of the bridge itself. The bridge continues to, its spans continue to be where they were, and it seems that there are two roadways on the bridge. One of those roadways is undamaged. Now, a lot of the pictures that we've seen of the event on the Kerch Bridge is due to a fire which took place because alongside the road, when there was the explosion, a train was passing apparently, and some of it was carrying fuel. There's a lot of trains with traveling with fuel, gasoline and such things to Crimea across the bridge, and some of the tankers on this train caught fire, and a lot of the pictures that we have seen of the fire on the bridge, which has now been extinguished, come from the gasoline tanks which also exploded. However, it seems that the railway part of the bridge has only suffered superficial damage and will probably be back in operation within a few days. The part of the bridge which has suffered road damage to the roadway, that will take longer to repair. Guesstimates put it at 3 to 6 weeks, but bear in mind that there is another part of the bridge which where there's a road surface, and that apparently is undamaged. So it's that kind of an incident. It's one which has caused vivid pictures, excited media commentaries in the West. What is its actual military significance? I would say none. I don't think it's going to make any difference whatsoever to the logistics situation. Bear in mind that with the existence of the land bridge, it's possible to send goods and traffic and whatever to Crimea directly from Russia through Sabotage and Kherson region. This is the area of Kherson region east of the Dnieper River, and for the moment it doesn't look as if this is going to make any fundamental difference either to the life of Crimea or to the situation of the Russian military further east in Kherson region where they're fighting Ukraine. And I would add, by the way, that if the railway part of the bridge is indeed capable of being repaired quickly, then of course it is the railway bridge, not the road bridge, which is important for military logistics, and it is also the important part for conveying goods and such things to Crimea as well. So that's where we are at the moment with the bridge. What about the political implications of this? Well, those will be greater. I mean, for the Russians, the Kerch Bridge is a very important, totemic, sensitive issue. Putin himself was informed. He's apparently been consulting with his officials. There's now widespread talk that the Russians will retaliate with strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. There's been even some suggestions that we could see attacks on the Ukrainian bridges that cross the Dnieper River. Now, as to that, I'm going to say a few things. I don't know whether the Russians are going to launch attacks on the bridges over the Dnieper River, but I did read a report somewhere, or rather heard a report on some YouTube channel, which is that destroying the Dnieper bridges would require 1,000 missiles, and it's debatable whether Russia has 1,000 missiles to destroy the Dnieper bridges. Well, that in itself seems to me questionable. How do we know how many missiles Russia has or doesn't have at any one particular point in time? There's never been any sign up to this point that Russia has any lack of missiles. I do wonder actually whether it would in fact need 1,000 missiles to knock out the Dnieper bridges. I mean, it is sometimes overlooked that Russia has a very extensive arsenal of missiles. There's the relatively small Calibre and X-101 cruise missiles, air-launched cruise missiles, which are subsonic and are similar to the US Tomahawk missiles. We don't know how many of those Russia has, but there doesn't seem to be any shortage of them. These are significantly bigger missiles than the HIMARS missiles that have been used by Ukraine to launch attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge, for example, in Kherson region. So they would presumably do more damage to the Dnieper River bridges. But I would agree it would take several of them, a large number of them, to cause significant damage. But Russia also has some much bigger and far more powerful missiles, which could be used against the Dnieper bridges. One is the KH-22 anti-ship missile, which has been used with enormous effect for land attack roles in Ukraine. This is a huge missile designed to destroy US Navy carriers. I would have thought that if one of those giant missiles were to hit a bridge like the Dnieper bridges at supersonic speeds, which is what we're talking about, then, I mean, the damage would be simply enormous and would probably do huge structural damage to these bridges. And then, of course, Russia now also has a growing arsenal of hypersonic missiles, the Kinzhal, and other hypersonic missiles that we know perhaps a little less about. And again, I would have thought that attacks from missiles of that nature would probably also cause huge damage to bridges if the Russians were to use them. So I don't want to speculate too far. I don't know what the Russians are going to do. I expect that for political reasons, there's huge anger about this attack in Russia. But I would expect that they will retaliate in some way if they really do want to knock out the Dnieper bridges. It seems to me that they have the means to do that. And of course, they could attack other areas of civilian infrastructure as well. This is all I'm going to say about this topic at the moment, except for one further thing, which is that from a security point of view, it must be an issue of concern for the Russians that this truck did manage to get through undetected with its very big bomb. And that does suggest that security on the Dnieper bridge is not on the Kerch bridge was not as tight as perhaps it ought to have been, and I'm pretty sure that it will be tightened extensively from this moment going forward. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this topic. Let's now discuss the situation on the battlefields. And before we do, I ought to say that we are now starting to see growing changes in the Russian command chain. And it seems that the Russians have now finally appointed an overall ground forces commander to supervise the entire Russian military forces, which, by the way, now include the Donbass militia, that they're now directly subordinate, finally, to the Russian command systems. Anyway, there is now an overall ground force commander in place, presumably on location, supervising all of these forces in every part of the battlefields in Kharkiv, in Donbass, in Zaporozhye, in Kherson. and he is General Surovikin. General Surovikin was one of the two generals, alongside General Lapin, who was responsible for the successful capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, along with various other military leaders, especially Chechen field commanders. So he's apparently an effective field commander, somebody in whom obviously the Russian military leadership has considerable confidence. And we are learning that General Surovikin is gradually placing more of his people that he knows and has worked with, in command positions, as one would expect of a new area commander. I discussed how a little while ago the chief of the Western Military Theatre, the part of the forces that deal with Kharkiv region, that also would have previously covered Izium and Balaklia and all those places that the Russians pulled out of, that the local theatre commander has now been replaced by a new commander who is known to be a close associate and even a protege of General Surovikin. Now, I have to say that this is one of those other things which I found somewhat surprising. Right at the start of the special military operation in March, there were reports from various people, various sources in Britain and the United States, expressing astonishment at the fact that there was no overall military commander in charge of all Russian forces in Ukraine. And I thought this could not possibly be true. I assumed that there was such a person and that the Western intelligence agencies were wrong about this. Well, it turns out that I was wrong and they were right for several weeks, months in fact, indeed, apparently right up to now. Various theatres, battlefronts have been commanded by their own local commanders, with overall coordination of the forces in Ukraine being conducted by the General Staff in Moscow, by General Valery Gerasimov, the Chief of the General Staff, and his team in Moscow. And I have to say, I do find this really surprising. And again, I wonder why this was the case. It may be that in March, the forces were so spread out in so many different places, in and around Kiev, around Chernigov and Sumy and whatever, that it made sense at that time to keep these separate commands. But again, I suspect that the underlying reason has much to do with the structure of the special military operation, the fact that the Donbass militia was able to operate under its own commanders, and that it might have been more difficult to create a unified command structure up to that point. Or it may be that there are other reasons. There may be hierarchical and bureaucratic reasons. Many people in Russian telegram and channels and on Russian mainstream media have been suggesting as much. One should never underestimate the importance of this kind of thing and the extent to which it afflicts all big organizations. As somebody who's worked for several, I can say how sometimes it can take a very long time for an organization to get all its structures, all its proper structures in place. The Red Army during the Second World War, being a case in point. The German army, by the way, during the Second World War, is an even greater case in point. It never fully sorted out its command structures, as I happen to know from somebody who served in it. But anyway, I'm not going to go down that particular route. But anyway, the fact is, apparently, with the various changes that we've seen, the referendums in the four regions, the decision to unite the four regions into Russia, the intention to set up a unified military command, the decision has finally been made to appoint one overall commander, General Surovikin. Now, I don't know anything about this person. I never heard of him until the fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. I don't know what sort of a person he is, what kind of an officer he is, what kind of a general he is. I would say that in the past there have been rumors that other generals have been placed in overall command of Russian forces participating in this war. I seem to remember that the British Ministry of Defence even named one general at one time, except it turned out that they were wrong about him. But anyway, regardless, the fact is that the Russians now do have one single overall commander, and some would say not before time. But that does represent a major change in the military structures of the war, and we can say that General Surovikin's appointment is real because it has been widely confirmed this time from Russian sources. Anyway, what about the situation on the battle fronts? Now, yesterday I spoke about the fact that on most of the fronts the situation has been quiet, except in Bakhmut and perhaps around Donetsk, and that it's the Russians who are conducting the offensives in these places. And as of this morning, if we put aside the drama, the theatre of the Kerch Bridge affair, that remains the case. And I think this is an important point to make. If advances continue, if the Ukrainian grouping in Bakhmut is cut off, unable to be resupplied, prevented from retreating, then that will be a very big operational crisis for Ukraine. And of course, if that group is defeated, if Bakhmut falls, I suspect that will be the biggest defeat either side has suffered over the course of this war. In fact, I would go further and I would say it would be the decisive battle that would probably decide the eventual outcome of the war. I say that not because I'm an expert in these matters, but because people from every side have been talking about the critical importance of Bakhmut in the overall Ukrainian defense system in Donbass. And of course, as I discussed yesterday, Ukraine has committed up to 1/10 of its army, apparently, to defend it. So that gives us some idea of how important Bakhmut is. Now, in a live stream that we did on the Duran a few days ago, where we were privileged to be joined by the outstanding reporter, Patrick Lancaster. Patrick made a very important point also about the other side of the battle that's going on in Donbass, which is the systematic but slow and incremental clearance by the pro-Russian forces, mainly the militia in this case, of these very heavy fortified positions that Ukraine created around Donetsk city, and the gradual encirclement of Avdiivka, which is the settlement, which is the linchpin of these defenses. And Patrick Lawrence said that if the shelling of Donetsk city is finally brought to an end, the Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk city is finally brought to an end, that in itself will cause a major improvement in morale. And that would be perhaps a game changer from the point of view of the people in Donbass. So that gives us an idea of how important that battle is. Bakhmut is important because it's a major logistical and transportation hub, apparently. It's also a place where large numbers of Ukrainian troops are concentrated. It's a big place with a large conurbation of small towns and settlements that form part of the Bakhmut area. Its fall would be a clear sign that Ukraine's position in Donbass was slipping, and in fact was probably coming to an end. And the clearance of the positions, Ukrainian positions around Donetsk city, would also be important, perhaps less from a military point of view, I would guess, but as a psychological effect, the feeling that this was, a moment when people could go about their everyday lives in Donetsk city without constant fear of being shelled, well, that would be a dramatic change as well. So that is where fighting has been taking place, and where most of the fighting has been taking place. I'm not going to, as I said, bore people by giving accounts of particular settlements and places that the Wagner group and the Donbass militia have been capturing, but apparently they have been making significant progress over the last few days in both places. Now, the other things that have been happening on the battlefields is that Ukraine made some further attempts yesterday to break through the Kherson defense lines, but was apparently unsuccessful. And one of the most interesting developments here was that the troops who apparently defeated the latest Ukrainian attack in Kherson region were not the Russian paratroopers who played the leading role in the defense of Kherson region up to this point in time, but were Chechen forces. Now, that shows that new forces are being deployed, new Russian forces are being deployed to Kherson, and that the Russian defense lines there are stiffening. And the same thing seems to be happening, for the moment at least, in northern Donbass. There's been lots of talk about further Ukrainian advances beyond Krasny Liman. They haven't so far been very visible, at least to me. All of the major positions that the Russians occupied when their forces pulled back from Liman are still under Russian control, as far as I can see. The Russian transportation and road links to these bases have so far not been affected. So for the moment, the Ukrainian ground offensive has not been proceeding. There's been, again, lots of talk about a Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye to try to cut this land bridge to Crimea. But again, there's been little sign of that for the moment. Maybe this attack on the Kerch Bridge is a sign that something like that is on its way. But for the moment, that doesn't seem to have happened. And there are large numbers of Russian troops now concentrated in this particular area, which must make an offensive in this area by Ukraine somewhat problematic, or so I would have thought. Now, maybe Ukraine still has some things it can do, and let's wait and see. And it could be, as I said many times, that by the time this video goes up, we will have seen further changes. But for the moment, over the last couple of days, the Ukrainian offensive seems to have come to a total stop. Now, the point about this is that time is not on Ukraine's side. Weather conditions apparently continuing to deteriorate, to change, the ground becoming softer. We've heard a lot about this. I mean, it's not just from Russian sources, it's not just from me. I mean, I take my reports from other sources about these things. But of course, we have had pieces in both the New York Times and the Financial Times talking about the problems that the soft ground and the weather will cause for any Ukrainian offensive. And we are now, it seems to me, very, very close now. Perhaps days, perhaps a week or so at most, or 2 weeks perhaps, even if you want to stretch it, from that point when weather conditions will make further offensives by the Ukrainian military much harder. And there's another factor which must be playing against prospects for Ukrainian offensives, and that is, of course, that the Russian mobilization is continuing. Now, as I said, there's been a huge amount of discussions about this. There's been lots of criticisms in the Russian media of things getting tangled up in some places, about people being sent to the wrong place, that kind of thing. All the sort of things that you would expect in a huge exercise like this. And I think people have spent far too much time, far too much energy playing it up. Of course, the Western media plays it up to a ridiculous degree, at least in my opinion. But the point is, and it's important to remember this, that amongst those people who have been called up, there will be many of them who have served in the military fairly recently. And I say fairly recently, within the last year or so. And they will obviously have had to go through periods of refresher training. They will also have had to go through further training to bring them back up to a level of fitness. But before long, perhaps within the next week or two, we should start to see some of these people being redeployed to their former units. Now, this is another point to say about mobilization. It may be that the Russians will indeed create some entirely new units with these 300,000 personnel, but I'm going to guess that a lot of these people, a lot of these reservists, will be sent to units which are already on the battlefields. Airborne troops in Kherson, ground forces troops in Zaporozhye, naval infantry, marines who are there, other people like that. And that will enable some of the troops who've been fighting now for some time to get some time off and to relax and refresh themselves. And it will also bring up the numbers again after this huge loss, apparently, of people when the 6-month contracts began to run out in August. So we should start to see over the next couple of weeks a significant increase in Russian combat power in Ukraine. And as the weeks and months continue, and as more of these reservists, the ones who have been furthest away from military, from working in the military, they start to come on stream as well. And again, I want to stress, these are people who have probably been in the military within the last 5 years or so. People who will still be fairly close to the military in some ways. People, as I said, in their mid to late 20s and early 30s in some cases. Not old men. Things like that. As more and more of these people come onto the battlefields, obviously, Ukrainian offensives will become more and more difficult because the Russian battle lines will start to thicken. So Ukraine doesn't have a very big time window. And something else has happened, perhaps more consequential in a way than the attack on the Kerch Bridge, which is that there now seem to be serious problems with Ukraine's communications. Now, this is an area where I am particularly inexpert. As those of you who know me will be aware, I am one of the least technical people on earth. I have little understanding of how technology, including communications technology, works. But there is an overwhelming consensus, in fact, there is no doubt at all, that over the last few months, since the start of the special military operation, Russia's special military operation, Ukraine, with extensive Western assistance, has shifted its communication system towards increasing or perhaps even total reliance on Elon Musk's Starlink satellite system. Now, I am not going to pretend that I understand at all how this works. What I would say is that though Elon Musk is the owner of all of these satellites, it seems that right from the outset, this very extensive satellite array was partly developed with the help of the US military. So it's always been designed to have a military application. And by the way, about a year ago, long before this operation, this war conflict in Ukraine began, I actually watched on YouTube a program, a Russian program, Russian television program, in which I actually heard Russian defense officials talk about their concerns about the potential military applications of this Starlink system that the United States, that Elon Musk was creating. Anyway, what we are now hearing is that this system is now starting to suffer breakdowns and outages. And there was a big piece about this on the Financial Times yesterday, and it was said that some of these problems were catastrophic, that they caused catastrophic communications failures. And of course, there's an enormous amount of speculation about what is the cause. It's been suggested that Elon Musk himself is responsible. He has got into a spat with the Ukrainians recently because he published a proposed peace agreement, or ideas for a peace agreement. The Ukrainians were furious about this. They derided and ridiculed him, and Ukraine's supporters in the Western media and on Twitter and all those sort of places all joined in. And supposedly Elon Musk, who's been complaining that the Ukrainians aren't paying him for their use of the Starlink system. Anyway, he supposedly, according to some people, might have switched some of their systems off in retaliation. Well, I suppose that's possible. How am I to say, one way or the other? I have to say, I think it is unlikely, and reading the articles which have been talking about this in the media, the Western media, I am starting to get the impression that the problems, Ukraine's problems with the Starlink system, started to manifest themselves before the spat with Elon Musk hit the headlines. In fact, I wonder whether the reality might even be the opposite, whether what triggered Musk's sudden interest in peace in Ukraine is the problems with the Starlink system, rather than him causing the Starlink system the problems of the Starlink system because he was annoyed with the response to his peace proposals from Ukraine. Now, if that is the case, if Elon Musk is not responsible for these problems, then presumably the Russians have found some means to start interfering with the signals. And again, there's all sorts of references to all kinds of Russian electronic warfare systems. The Russians are known to be particularly skilled in electronic warfare and jamming and that kind of thing. I'm not going to discuss any of that. I don't pretend to understand it very well. But if that is the case, then that is a major problem for Ukraine, given how much they've come to depend on the Starlink system over the last few months. And I would suggest that this is a bigger problem, a far bigger problem, if all these points that I've been making are correct. It's a much bigger problem for Ukraine than whatever logistical hiccups Russia is going to experience as a result of the damage to the Kerch Bridge. So there are other things going on, and I'm going to return now to that very strange, those very strange comments about Armageddon, nuclear Armageddon, that President Biden made the other day. Now, when I discussed them in my previous videos, I hadn't fully understood how very strange these comments actually were, because they were not made by President Biden in a speech, in an address to the American people. They were not made publicly, at least in a public venue where there was the TV cameras or anything like that there. They were made over the course of a fundraiser, a Democratic Party fundraiser, in the run-up to the November midterms. And what makes it even weirder is that this wasn't even what Biden was leading it with, and it wasn't the main topic of his discussion, of his comments. The main topic, the thing he started with, was again the alleged threat to America's institutions from the Republican Party. And apparently he talked about that for some time, and then somehow or other, along the way, he started to talk about the danger of nuclear Armageddon, spoke about the prospects of a second Cuban Missile Crisis, and started to talk about trying to find an off-ramp for President Putin. All very strange and very bizarre. And then what makes it even weirder is that we started to get reports in parts of the US media that US intelligence was baffled by these remarks. They've seen no sign of the Russians making any kind of preparations for use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine in any shape or form. And as I've discussed in many programs, the Russians have never actually floated that possibility or made any threats about that. Though you'd never think so from the way in which the media in the West has been running this story. Whilst I'm on that topic, by the way, I would say that there have been threats since the end of the Second World War to use tactical nuclear weapons in conventional war situations. It is an accepted historical fact. It is accepted within the academic community. In fact, it is incontrovertible that President Eisenhower in the 1950s threatened the Soviets with use of nuclear weapons in Korea unless the Soviets assisted with a ceasefire agreement to bring the fighting in Korea in the 1950s to an end. And we also know, and again this is incontrovertible history, that in 1968 the overall US commander in Vietnam, General Westmoreland, seriously considered, in fact apparently pushed for the use of tactical nuclear weapons during the siege in 1968 of a US Marine base at a place called, I understand, Khe Sanh. Americans can correct me if I'm wrong about that. So, this is not something that has never been pondered about before, but there's no evidence it has ever been considered by the Soviets in any of their military operations, and there's no evidence that it's ever been seriously considered or even discussed by the Russians over the course of military operations in Ukraine. So why do we constantly hear this drumbeat of discussions about all of this? Why is this endless harping, including by President Biden, in this very weird, I think rather alarming, off-the-cuff way, all this talk about nuclear war and the use of nuclear weapons by the Russians in Ukraine? And I have to say that I'm not really sure. There are some suggestions that this is all intended in some way to shake Russian confidence in President Putin. And of that, I have no doubt at all that there is a very real agenda and underway to try to undermine President Putin's position in Russia. This has been very much a lot of what the media in the West has been doing. I noticed, for example, that there were reports all over the British media, and they've been taken up by the British Ministry of Defence, about a member of Putin's inner circle who supposedly is criticising the conduct of the war. And again, there's a lot of mystification as to who this person is supposed to be, but in fact there's no doubt that the person who's referred to or being referenced is Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Russian businessman, sometimes referred to as Putin's cook, because he runs a catering operation amongst other businesses, and who is the titular person who supposedly set up, and who claims to have set up, the Wagner Group. Though, as I said, I'm fairly sure, as I said, discussed in an earlier program, I'm fairly sure that the Russian Ministry of Defense has played a significant role in putting the Wagner Group together. Now, Prigozhin did publish a comment about a week or so ago, supporting some criticisms that Ramzan Kadyrov had made of the Russian military command following the fall of Liman. And clearly there's some attempt now to make out that Prigozhin is leading, or is perhaps the front man for some sort of hardline faction in the Kremlin that is supposedly challenging President Putin. The trouble is, I don't believe a word of it. I think that is utter and complete nonsense. I think the idea that Prigozhin, of all people, is in any kind of position to bring a political challenge against President Putin is fantastical. And I think people who are talking about this either don't understand Russian politics, or perhaps don't care and are more interested and concerned to spin a narrative. I think that no doubt there are some tensions between some members of the irregular forces, the Chechens, and people like Prigozhin, and some of the regular military in Russia. And it will be General Surovikin's job, amongst other things, to sort all that out. But the idea that Prigozhin is the spokesman or the leader of some kind of hardline faction in the Kremlin is, to my mind, utter fantasy. But anyway, could be that the talk about nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine is intended to foster this picture of Putin as some kind of person who's slipping, who's taking increasingly reckless gambles and things of that kind. Or it could be intended, and this seems to me much more plausible, that it's intended to weaken international support for Russia. I mean, the United States and its officials and the British and their officials must know that the international reaction to the use of nuclear weapons by the Russians in Ukraine would be colossal and massively negative for Russia. I mean, it would destroy Russia's reputation. Now, Western leaders are known to have been extremely irritated by the fact that the global South seems to be increasingly aligning with Russia over the Ukraine conflict. We saw how China, India, and Brazil refused to support a resolution critical of Russia at the latest UN Security Council meeting, when the United States tried to put together such a resolution shortly after Russia took steps to begin the annexation of the 4 regions. And then, twisting the knife even further, we've had Saudi Arabia's oil production cut, OPEC Plus's oil production cut. And it could be that all this talk about nuclear weapons is intended to shake the support for Russia of all of these people. I would add, by the way, that Saudi Arabia's decision to move forward with this oil production cut, and I've discussed the reasons for that in previous programs, and I'm not going to go back and cover them again, but it gives us further insight about why the Russians have been keen to maintain dialogue with the Saudis, why the Russians accepted Saudi mediation, for example, for the release of all those British volunteer soldiers that they'd captured. Obviously, from a Russian point of view, they want to keep on good terms with the Saudis. And if you're adopting a tough-minded calculus, which is what you should do if you're in a conflict situation, then if you're going to get a 2 million a day cut, barrels a day cut in oil production from Saudi Arabia and OPEC Plus, and you're Russia, then to be frank, that's worth exchanging a couple of British volunteer fighters for. So, but it could be, as I said, that is what the what all this talk of nuclear weapons is all about. I don't know, but what I will say is this: I think that this constant harping about nuclear weapons, about President Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons, which he has never done, about the Russians considering using nuclear weapons, I think that this is actually not just irresponsible and reckless, as I've discussed in an earlier video, but I suspect that it's going to start backfiring before very long. And I think we're already starting to see some signs of this in the United States. I noticed, for example, that the Republicans, and specifically Byron York, who is a prominent Republican-aligned journalist, but very mainstream, has written a very strongly critical piece about Biden's comments. I mean, he's made it fairly clear that he thinks all this is, frankly, completely over the top, and it makes absolutely no sense for Biden to have talked in this way about this subject. Byron York, by the way, seems to link these bizarre comments with the November midterms and Biden trying to create some kind of narrative over the November midterms. Well, all I can say is I think all this talk of nuclear war in the United States is more likely to convince most Americans, at least those who are interested in this conflict, that this is a conflict which is veering out of control and that some kind of peace negotiations should be started as soon as possible. But that's another thing. And of course, we've seen that people in the intelligence community are beginning to become annoyed as well. Anyway, whatever, I think that this talk, this incessant chatter in the United States and Britain about the Russians using nuclear weapons is irresponsible and misconceived. President Zelensky making even more outrageous comments about the need for preemptive strikes against Russia, which he tried to walk back, by the way, afterwards, seems to have hitched onto this particular bandwagon. I think what this is going to do in time, especially in the global south, is it's going to harden feelings there that it's the United States and some of the Western powers and their leaderships which are the ones that need paying attention to, because it is they who are talking recklessly about nuclear war rather than the Russians. I forgot to add, by the way, that another person who seems to have been annoyed by all this talk was President Macron of France. So anyway, we will see whether the Western powers, whether I should say the British and the Americans, persist with this thing. So there we go. It seems to me that we've had this attack on the Crimea bridge. We'll see how long it takes to repair. Not very long, I suspect. We will see what the Russians do in retaliation. We'll see what General Surovikin manages. We'll see whether the Ukraine can sort out its communications problems with the Starlink system and resume its offensive, and if so, what that achieves. And in the meantime, we will see how all this bizarre talk of nuclear war, disturbing talk of nuclear war, plays out. That's me again for the day. I'll be no doubt covering all these topics in future programs, and have a very good day until I come back and I talk about these things again. So please remember, you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, and by the way, we are now also on Rofkin as well. So you can look us up on Rofkin. We'll be publishing exclusive content there. So join us on Rofkin as well as on all of these other platforms. And please remember that I do live streams exclusively on Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time, when you can put whatever questions you wish to me and make your own comments as well, by the way. And then and then also you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to go to our shop and buy the great things, the amazing merchandise that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon, and have a very good day.